I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined once again by Patrick Wyman. And can we talk a little more, very briefly, before we get into today's topics about that excellent Brian Stann interview last week, Pat?
That was a hell of a lot of fun.
What a fucking pleasure talking to Brian Stann was. A bunch of people responded. I'm really pleased at the fan response to it. A lot of people said it was one of the most insightful and inspiring and interesting interviews they'd ever heard, which is very high praise both for us and for Brian. But we were both very interested in hearing what Brian had to say. We'd love to have him back on the show. And I know some people don't love when we do interview shows because they tune in to hear our sonorous voices bouncing back and forth. They tune in to hear the siren song of Pat and Connor, but it's a great opportunity for you and I as well as hosts to be able to talk to somebody with that much knowledge and experience. And also, I think like every man my age in the U.S., I kind of want Brian Stann to be my dad. So
yeah, he really is fantastic. I mean, I have to say, like, talking to him and Firas Zahabi, they're probably my two favorite people to interview and talk to in all of MMA, man.
Yeah.
Like, just like both of the interviews I've done with Stan now after this last one, like, I've walked away, like, not just with more respect for him as a person, if that were possible, but like having learned a lot. Like, I feel like there are learning experiences for us as analysts. Yeah.
Easy interview too. Other people who are trying to publicize themselves, perhaps in the ways that Brian suggested during that interview, take note. Brian Stann's a good talker. We had like 6 questions prepared and we didn't even get through all of them. The man has a lot to say, and it's all interesting. So anyway, it was a pleasure. We're glad that all of you guys listening to the show enjoyed it as much as you did. You got a great response. So kudos to you and to Brian Stann. Today's topic, we've got a little bit of a lull in the UFC schedule once again. A bit of a gap between fights. UFC Zagreb, pretty solid card. One with some of the most difficult to pronounce names in the history of the UFC because many of them are East European, Polish, Bosnian, Croatian. But a fairly solid card with a very interesting heavyweight matchup. We'll be talking about that next week because it's not till April 10th, is it?
Yeah, it is April 10th. It is a week from Saturday.
All right. So until then, we thought we would do a little bit of a mixed bag of topics today. We've got a topic first from a listener. If you pledge $20 or more to Heavy Hands on Patreon, you too can suggest a topic. That'll get 15 or 20 minutes of in-depth discussion out of Pat and I, possibly bleed into the rest of the show. And then later on in this episode, we are going to be discussing up-and-coming fighters that interest us, not necessarily fighters outside the UFC, but even ones who have made it to the big show and are still kind of in that prospect phase of their career where we're still watching them develop and watching them go through tests and see what kind of fighters they are. So that'll make up the latter half of this show. But first, we wanted to answer this question from Jake Christina. And Jake asks, who do you guys feel is the best at adapting mid-fight, and who seems the most capable of piecing together the information his opponents give him to snatch victory? What do you say, Pat? We've got a few names here, but who do you want to talk about first?
Well, I think that the first one that comes to mind, and literally could be the person that you would be talking about here, is Jon Jones. I don't think there's anybody better in MMA history at adapting over the course of the fight to what they're seeing from their opponent, to the strategic situation, to the tactical situation, than Jon Jones. He just gets it. And when I was talking to Greg Jackson back in November in Albuquerque, he said that what sets that kind of ability to make decisions is what sets apart the very, very, very elite from everybody else. Like, you can know theoretically what you're supposed to do, but if you can't make that decision under pressure, with the weight of the world on you at exactly the right time and exactly the right way, it's all for naught. And some guys have that. Some guys are born with it, and some guys aren't. Jon Jones has that trait in spades.
Do you think that trait is more than anything? I would argue that maybe durability is kind of that one talent thing you can't do without, but maybe not even then. If you're a really good defensive fighter, Wilfredo Benitez was not a very durable fighter, and he was still excellent. So maybe it is adaptability. Would you argue that? Would you agree with the idea that not only is it important for fighters in general, but that it may be the most important trait for a champion to have in order to dominate a division, challenger after challenger, all of these guys learning from past fighters' mistakes?
I don't think it's necessarily the most important trait, but I think it's what sets apart the all-time greats from very good fighters.
Are there any, I mean, in the UFC at the very least, are there any, or even in MMA, are there any dominant champions who have not been good to great adaptive fighters? There's not really any I can think of. We've got Jose Aldo, we've got George St. Pierre, we have Jon Jones, we have Fyodor Emelianenko, we've got Anderson Silva. All of these guys are really good at finding openings over the course of a fight, capitalizing on what their opponents give them, sometimes in different ways. But all of them have had these difficult fights where it basically takes a split-second change or an adjustment over the course of several rounds to turn the fight in their favor, you know?
Well, I don't know if you would put him into the great champions category, but I don't think Chuck Liddell, a guy who had a lot of title defenses under his belt, was a great adaptive fighter.
No, probably not.
I'm just trying, just for the sake of argument, I'm trying to think of some counter examples.
There aren't many at the very least.
Yeah, I never thought that BJ Penn was a great adaptive fighter.
Yeah, you're on the spot there. On the spot. You're on the dot, on the money? What's the phrase I'm looking for?
I think that in the broad scheme of things, BJ Penn was adaptive from fight to fight, like when he came out and wrestled John Fitch.
Or when he came out on his tippy toes against Frankie Edgar.
Yeah, well, can we just not? We just pretend that fight didn't happen.
You don't want to talk about that?
No, I don't want to talk about that fight. I don't think that Anderson Silva was necessarily a great adaptive fighter. I think that Anderson was going to do what Anderson wanted to do. Okay, let me think about this take here for a second.
It's an interesting question. So just a preemptive thanks to Jake Christina for the topic, because there's because Jose Aldo may be the same as Anderson Silva. Jose Aldo is not necessarily, he's a great adaptive fighter. He's a little more focused than Anderson, who is just a bizarre enigma to beat all bizarre enigmas. But he is also like the supremely tactical fighter who can kind of get lost in these moment to moment engagements and not really pick up on where he might be in the fight. I've often thought that was the key to a fighter beating Jose Aldo, unless, of course, you can spark him into unconsciousness in 13 seconds, is to get him wrapped up in these tight back-and-forth exchanges and let him lose sight of what he needs to be doing to dominate the fight. And Anderson definitely had those flaws, but he was an opportunist like few others.
Yeah, that's true. Anderson could read his opponent. I think that we need to distinguish here between tactical and strategic adaptability, right?
Sure.
Jon Jones is supremely good at both of those things, both at recognizing where you're at in the broad scheme of the fight and how he needs to be fighting depending on where he's at in the scorecards. Does he need to emphasize body work early?
George St. Pierre is the same way.
Yeah, exactly. George St. Pierre was supremely smart in terms of making in-fight adjustments based on strategic considerations.
Yep.
Jose Aldo, supremely tactical fighter. Anderson Silva, I think, is a supremely tactical fighter too. Like Anderson Silva would have been perfectly happy going the last minute and 20 seconds of that Sonnen fight on his back.
Yeah.
Because I think he thought in his heart of hearts that he was going to submit Chael
Sonnen. That was the kind of exchange he was being given, and he was going to find a way to win that kind of exchange.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. For people who haven't heard us discuss this in a while, it's been a while since we've had the strategy versus tactics discussion. In our parlance, strategy is concerned with the question why. Why should I be doing this? Why should I stop him from doing this? And tactics is concerned with the question how. How do I do this? How do I, get him to fall for this? How do I set up this trap? Whatever. Strategies need tactics, but tactics aren't necessarily part of a wise strategy. So for a strategically minded fighter like Jon Jones or George St. Pierre, all of the tactics they employ, hand fighting in the clinch, closing the distance, smothering, keeping the opponent on the end of a jab, they are typically in service of a large, clearly defined strategy. Whereas guys like Jose Aldo, Anderson Silva, they suffer a little bit sometimes from being very tactical, but you could argue that they are better than guys like GSP at coming up with split-second adjustments, very quick, and coming up with definitive answers no matter what kind of difficulty they are given.
That's why guys like Jose Aldo and Anderson Silva are such incredible counterpunchers.
Yeah.
Because they understand that if you want to counterpunch somebody effectively, it's not just a matter of it's not just a matter of the split-second timing. It's also a matter of understanding the tactical situation that allows you to counterpunch effectively.
Yeah, finding those openings. It's like having a rapid computing process happening in the head where you are collecting data second by second, not applying it to the overall plan of the fight, but rather applying it to, when he throws his jab, where is his head? Where is it going to be the next time he throws it? How can I get him to throw the jab? How can I counter it? How can I make sure to hurt him as much as possible with that counter? All of these little tiny, the minutia of fighting is what the tacticians excel at. So
exactly. And what makes Jon Jones so special is that he can hold that in his head at the same time as he's holding in his head the broader strategic considerations.
Yeah, I wonder if some of that has to do with Jones working with Greg Jackson. If he was because I think Jones has probably been a tactically minded fighter for longer than he's been a great strategist, and I think the strategic style has come out largely as a result of him being a champion for so long now. Where obviously we see fewer finishes from Jon Jones nowadays. We see more decisions, more drawn-out contests. We still see amazing adjustments, but we also see fewer crazy dynamic attacks and the same. He's not the same Jon Jones that beat Stephan Bonner or the one that took the title from Shogun Rua. He doesn't fight the same exact way as that guy used to. And it's not just because the way that Jon Jones used to develop from fight to fight was to add crazier and crazier techniques to his arsenal, and that's not the way Jon Jones develops anymore.
Yeah, but we saw Jose Aldo as a long-term champion for a long time working under another highly strategic mind, and Jose Aldo still never really developed in quite the same kind of awe-inspiring way strategically, I think experience is part of it, but I think you have to have that aptitude in the first place, and I don't think there's any question that Jones has that raw aptitude.
He definitely gets it, and he seems to get it quite easily, to the point where, there's this narrative now surrounding Jones that he likes to do what his opponents they struggle the most with, and I think there is maybe a bit of that competitiveness to Jones, but I think he also recognizes better than many other people, and Greg Jackson as well, how to quickly break his opponents. In the same way that GSP did. A lot of GSP strategies revolved around the notion that he could... What was it that Faraz said about him once? He said that he tried to beat his opponents where they were best first and then beat them where they were weakest, or is it the other way around?
Well, no, so you want to beat them where they're weak first.
And then beat them where they're best.
Yeah, and then drag them back to where they're strong and beat them there too.
To completely break them. And I think Jones gets that as well. Like the Glover Teixeira fight, nominally you could say that that's the range that suits Glover Teixeira, or the Daniel Cormier fight. Nominally you could say that Daniel Cormier needs to be in close, but Jones is very good at controlling how and when those in-close exchanges happen. He's not going to allow you to decide the range. He's going to decide it whether it's the range you think you want or not. That makes sense? You know what I picked up on in that I've watched the Daniel Cormier fight like 3 times in the past 2 weeks because it's so good. And I watched the Glover Teixeira fight a few times as well. Jon Jones's split-second adjustments and his ability to manage distance is so much better than it used to be, because Jon Jones was for a long time not very good in mid-range and had a very limited way of making sure that mid-range didn't happen. He's now much better at alternating between giving distance and taking away distance depending on his position in the cage.
Yeah, his timing is much better.
Yeah,
right?
He's
much better at picking his spots to sit down, when he's going to do that, when he's going to move. it's inspiring to watch somebody become a better outfighter through the process of long training. Obviously, like I don't think he ever looked better in that regard than he did against Cormier. Like it's shocking how good he looked at that.
Yeah, a lot. I mean, it definitely, the Cormier fight gave you the impression that given another fight with Alexander Gustafsson, Jones would be more dominant than the first time. Would have an easier time at range. Do you disagree with that?
No, I don't disagree with that at all. I may be one of the few people who thinks this way, but I thought that Jones won the first fight pretty convincingly, 3-2.
I thought he won. I thought he won the Gustafsson fight. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a surprising number of people now who remember that, like say Bisping Sonnen, as just an utter robbery, when really it was a reasonably close fight, but in no way, shape, or form does it fall into that category. But no, I mean, I always thought, even in the first place, like leaving aside the issue of Jones's improvement since then, that a Jones who was taking that fight more seriously would have won it handily regardless.
Yeah, because he didn't seem to be prepared for that fight very well. Jones's wrestling has never looked more impotent than in that bout.
Yeah, he looked like a guy who rolled up without really taking it seriously.
A guy who drove 65 and a 35 to the arena morning of the fight, shook off a hangover and stepped into the octagon.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about a few other guys we have written down here. There are a few other people who are known for their adaptability. The one I really want to discuss is Demetrius Johnson, and I want to talk about whether Demetrius Johnson is a tactical adjuster or a strategic adjuster, or is he a bit of both? Any notion?
Yeah, I think he's both. I think that we talk about Jon Jones in this facet, but I think that really Demetrius Johnson may even be better than Jon Jones is, because he makes both the strategic and the tactical adjustments. He has a plan, but it's not a plan that he's wedded to, and he sees how he can build in layers towards both the tactical and the strategic outcomes that he wants over the course of the fight.
Yeah, I wonder. I wonder if Demetrius Johnson isn't just a great tactical fighter, and it ends up making him appear to be a great strategic fighter. I think Demetrius Johnson is so well-rounded that when he finds the way to get to a given range, it's like he's gonna for example, if Demetrius Johnson discovers in the course of a fight that I guess that's strategy. If he discovers in the course of the fight that clinching with you is the way to beat you, that is his strategic mindset, even if it isn't a preordained strategy. And I guess once he hits upon the single tactic that works best against you, I'm mushmouth today. He's better than just about anybody else at finding the way into that phase or into that range, and then sort of following a flow chart of options off of that to play off of the threat he's just given you. So I guess that is a strategic mindset combined with an excellent tactical acuity as well.
Yeah, I really think he can do all of those things. He can do all of them at once. He can build from technique to technique in a way that reinforces whatever strategic choice that he's wanted to make. Like, I think if there's anybody who comes close to Jon Jones in that facet, it's Demetrius Johnson. I mean, I think he's nearly on that level. And I really think it's those two, and then we're talking about everybody else miles and miles and miles beneath them.
In terms of,
in terms of the ability to make both tactical and strategic adjustments.
Yeah. It kind of seems to come and go with a lot of other fighters, and it's just like every single fight you see of Demetrius Johnson and Jon Jones, it is just every single time you get to watch like this brilliant thought process, or even if it's a process of feel rather than clear thinking, you get to watch it play out in such clear fashion in front of you as the fight plays out. It's pretty crazy. Hopefully Jon Jones fights Daniel Cormier. Hopefully that happens, because I would really like to see all this stuff we just talked about. This in a weird way, our discussion has made me sad, knowing that it could possibly, the fight may have run into an obstacle today.
Yeah, it would be real nice if we were lucky enough to see that go down. I don't know if we'll be so lucky though.
Yeah. I made my corny comment on Twitter not long ago where I said, we really are lucky to be witnessing the career of Jon Jones. I almost feel like I'm unlucky now to be witnessing it because it could have been so much better without all this shit thrown in the way, without Jon Jones being Jon Jones. Man, if only.
But that Jon Jones is just not separable.
It's
He's
true.
not separable
We
from
discussed
the guy who can do all those brilliant things in the cage.
We talked about it a little bit ago. We were talking about how complicated, what a tangled mess the makeup of a fighter is. No sport brings out the virtues and the foibles of a fighter, of a person like MMA or boxing, combat sports in general, almost, particularly ones where you're being punched in the face. I think no sport brings that out the same way. And how complicated you realize a person is when they are an elite fighter, and how you can't have Jon Jones without him just being an utter shithead. Like you can't, you don't get to have Jon Jones's brilliance without Jon Jones's assholery.
Yeah, it's the kind of confidence that allows him to make those insane adjustments in the middle of a fight, like hitting a spinning back elbow on Alexander Gustafsson to change the course of the fight in the 4th round. All of that stuff. Like, it's not separable from the guy who wants to drag race at a stoplight or do whatever, like do stupid things behind the wheel.
The guy who gives a waitress his number while being profiled by Greg Howard.
Yeah, exactly that guy. Like that one anecdote. If you guys have never read this story that Greg Howard wrote for Deadspin about a year and a half ago, called "How Jon Jones Became the Baddest Motherfucker on Earth," like no author, I don't think, no sports writer has ever understood the subject of a profile better than Greg Howard did by the end of that piece. That like he encapsulates Jon Jones perfectly. Because this is the anecdote that ends like the first section of that article, is Jones leaving his number for a waitress in the presence of a writer who he knows is writing about.
Shortly after asking if the lunch was on the record.
Exactly. Like it's just like that is Jon Jones, and the guy that does that is the same guy for the same reasons who does incredible things in the cage.
He feels that he's untouchable. And that comes with its pluses as well as its minuses, its pros as well as its cons. So thank you again for your question, Jake. That was a fun topic to discuss. For the rest of the show now, after a short break, we are going to come back and discuss up-and-coming fighters. Hopefully we can have learned from this adaptability, and we can maybe identify from there what fighters have potential to be champions, if we've perhaps identified it as one of the more key ingredients to dominance in MMA. So after this break, up-and-comers, prospects, blue chippers, etc., right after this. Hey everybody, thanks for listening to this week's Heavy Hands. If you like what you hear, please consider pledging to support the podcast on Patreon. Patreon is basically continuous crowdfunding. You sign up to contribute a certain amount per month to help us with production costs and the like, and in return you get rewards ranging from a mention on the Heavy Hands website to a question or topic of your choice being discussed on the show. We have a lot more in the works to reward you for your help, and we appreciate every contribution. No amount is too small. Just head over to patreon.com and find how you can help out, the only show dedicated to the finer points of face punching. Now let's get back to it. And we are back after a lengthy mid-segment discussion, because we're just besties, me and you, Pat. We're just besties.
That did get a little bit out of hand.
After a lengthy... By the way, did you happen to see... did Luis Richard do it? The Heavy Hands drinking game?
No, huh?
Oh, it's a good one. I'm going to scroll through while we're talking and bring it up inappropriately later, but he came up with some criteria for a Heavy Hands drinking game that would surely get you killed by the end of an episode. One of the reasons that you drink is Pat and Connor reference something they discussed before they began recording. So that's happened twice already in this episode. If you're playing Heavy Hands drinking game, I'm sorry, or you're welcome, depending on how far along you are.
Your liver's in trouble. Your liver is going to be in trouble.
Definitely. So anyway, while I'm looking for that, we wanted to discuss up-and-coming fighters. We thought it would be a good opportunity to talk about a lot of guys that maybe haven't achieved the level of stardom that normally requires that normally inspires us to discuss them. And there are a lot of these guys in MMA right now. Pat, I'm going to let you lead, because I'm sure I will take up a lot of time when I get to the one guy I really want to talk about. So who do you have your eye on most firmly at this time?
Well, I think that there are a number of different guys. I mean, this is a really talent-rich time in MMA, especially at the lighter weight classes, which is why if you're an observer of MMA and somebody writing about it, you have to hope that fan attention can shift down the weight scale. because that's really where the talent is. It's where the most exciting young fighters are to be found. It's unfortunate that the biggest draws historically have been at heavyweight and light heavyweight because there's not a whole lot of up and coming talent there. Like we could be at a point where you need to fold those divisions together just to have enough talent to continue running them, or just risk them becoming like irrelevant sideshows. But so really, the bulk of the new up and coming talent is between 135 and 170 pounds. That's really where the best guys are at. But so I have a bunch, I think, at bantamweight, and obviously we're going to talk a lot more about these guys as this fight comes up.
Yeah.
But I think Cody Garbrandt and Tomas Almeida are just the cream of that crop right now. Aljamain Sterling too, but he's already broken through, I'd say.
And thanks to the UFC model of matchmaking, these two promising prospects are fighting each other, which I both like and dislike.
Yeah, you hate to see one of these guys walk away with a loss, but at the same time, this is going to be freaking fireworks. Like, this is the fight of everything that's coming up that I am most excited about as a fight.
So let's talk about Garbrandt first. What in particular stands out? I mean, I suppose we should talk about both these fighters as fighters, but also kind of the methodology for identifying what makes them seem like a prospect, what inspires you to keep your eye on them in the first place about them.
Well, so I've been on Almeida for years now. Like, Almeida I had as the third-ranked prospect on my Searching for Future Champions scouting report, and that was like in the beginning of 2014. I think I wrote up Almeida in like February of 2014. So he's been
only. I want to point out that is only by the most technical definition years. That is just barely more than 2 years.
Yeah, but it was a while ago in MMA terms as these things go.
Yes, things move quickly in this sport.
They do. I mean, you think about how many guys from that point in time are now considered busted prospects.
Right.
Like, back in February of 2014, we still thought Eric Silva was gonna be a thing.
Yeah, I was thinking about how recently Junior Dos Santos was running through the heavyweight division, and how many careers I've just seen crumble in my brief time following this sport. Things move along at quite a clip.
Yeah, I mean, we don't need to get bogged down in that, but yes, that is absolutely a thing. So Almeida, Almeida is just a violence machine. Like, he's 20-0, and 19 of his wins are by finish, 16 of those are by knockout. Like, he's got stupid power for a 135-pound guy. He's got ridiculous cardio. He works at a great pace. He's an extremely technical offensive striker, and he can hurt you from a wide array of distances. The fact that he's so good at exchanging in the pocket marks him out as being kind of unique in MMA. There are very few guys who can be that technical and that mean inside the pocket who can hurt you, especially at that weight.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. The thing is with a guy like Garbrandt. I mean, so let's look at it from this angle. What do you want to see from Garbrandt as he develops? What improvements can he make to fulfill your expectations?
Well, Garbrandt has a lot left to learn. I mean, he's not quite as raw as I had kind of thought he was, but he's only been a pro, technically speaking, for a little more than 3 years, and in that time he's only had 8 professional fights. Like, in terms of what I'm looking for, I think he needs to mix things up. I think he needs to continue to mix things up. He's a pretty good wrestler. He's a really good athlete. I think he needs to work that together. He's a really good boxer. He is a really, really polished striker for a guy who's only 24 who has that little experience. Like, he is really, really sharp and really, really advanced for that little experience. What stands out about him to you, Connor?
I don't know. I think that Garbrandt, he showed I've gone back and forth in that fight he had with Henry Briones, because in some ways it looks like a guy not doing as well as you expect, but depending on how you view Henry Briones, it also looks pretty promising. I thought he showed a decent amount of maturity in that fight, and you were the one who kind of brought this up to me after realizing that he wasn't going to get Briones out of there early, because that is the kind of fighter Garbrandt is. You almost get to this point where you expect him to have all of his wins by stunning knockout. But I thought he showed a good bit of maturity, and I guess I would like to continue to see that develop, to continue to see him deal with adversity, and to continue to see him, like, not knocking someone out's a pretty light kind of adversity. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. I have a feeling he's going to be put through some much more serious adversity when he fights Tomas Almeida. So I'm interested to see how he deals with not getting to have the kind of fight that he's used to having as such an athletically gifted prospect.
Yeah, what's going to happen when Almeida backs him into the fence and drops a 6-punch combination on him?
Yeah.
Like, how does Garbrandt react to that?
Yeah.
Like, so yeah, I'm with all of that. Like, the point about maturity is an important one when you're talking about a guy like Cody Garbrandt, because what comes through really clearly about Almeida is how patient he is, and how in the one fight he's had that went to a decision, he didn't panic, he didn't freak out when he didn't get the finish. He just had a really sound process all the way through. And in the Briones fight, you could easily see how after not the roughest first round, but not an easy first round, Garbrandt could have resorted to throwing one-hitter quitters in an increasingly desperate attempt to get Briones out of there, and either getting himself finished or losing a 29-28 decision. Like, you could easily see how that would have happened to him, but he didn't. And even even in his last fight against an obviously overmatched Augusto Mendez, like, Garbrandt was still patient. He still put it together. He has a sound underlying process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Just an update. I can't seem to find that Heavy Hands drinking game.
Oh,
I'm looking for it. I'm going to have to go. It was Rich GP or Luis Richard or someone, a friend of the show somewhere, who came up with this game. Because when we do the Heavy Hands live cast, I want to destroy some people's livers. So how about Thomas Almeida? Because Almeida's a very different kind of fighter from Cody Garbrandt. I think what stands out about, and I think you and I have kind of leaked the fact that we both expect Almeida to beat Garbrandt. Mm-hmm. Almeida, to me, is really impressive because of, I think the most impressive thing about Almeida that I've seen so far was the change in style he showed between his UFC debut and his most recent fight with
Anthony
Birchak, which I expected to be a very difficult fight. Not one that I expected him to lose, but one that I expected to pose some serious problems for him, and it did not in the slightest. And I think Almeida showed a much keener sense of distance management in that fight. Didn't feel as pressured to go crazy from the outset. And I think that's what's kind of hurt him in the past, is perhaps we had to watch him understand that he, too, couldn't have the exact kind of fight he wanted each time out. He couldn't just run over every opponent, and it maybe didn't suit him to always be as aggressive as he can. Because Almeida's got a very innately aggressive style, and it was like he had to learn, almost like a Carlos Condit, where he kind of had to learn from negative reinforcement what to do and what not to do by fighting at his preferred pace all the time. And in the Birchak fight, I thought he started a little more carefully, a little more cautiously, and worked up to his optimal speed, which showed a good bit of wisdom, a bit of experience to me.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, Connor, because you saw against Brad Pickett, though there was never any doubt in my mind that Almeida was going to win his kind of fight against Brad Pickett. Mm-hmm. You know, that there were things that Pickett could do and did do in that fight to give Almeida trouble. He knocked him down with a nice left hook in the first round. We saw just how delightfully crisp Brad Pickett's pocket boxing is, and the ways in which it was more crisp than Almeida's. But there was never any doubt that at the end of the day, if they fought like that for 3 rounds, at some point Almeida was going to put him down. You know what I mean? Like, no, even if he had to go through some adversity to get to that point, Almeida was going to win that kind of fight against Brad Pickett. It was not a given that Almeida was going to win a brawling fight with Anthony Birchak. And so, knowing that, Almeida kind of took his foot off the gas a little bit and decided he was going to start a bit slower, be a bit more technical with his approach. And we saw just how good he can be when he does that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing that continue to develop. I think if we have Almeida finding his openings and then pressing the action, that does give him an edge over Garbrandt, whose preferred pace tends to be a lot slower, more picking his shots, more maintaining the distance, more eyeing his openings. Almeida is the kind of guy who forces openings. He presents them, and it'll be dangerous for him with a hitter like Garbrandt, but I'm interested to see if he can continue developing along that track when they meet in the future.
So we took a look at a couple of bantamweights here, Connor. What about featherweights? Are there featherweights that stand out to you as up-and-comers?
Who did I have at featherweight? Well, there's Max Holloway, who we have talked about an awful lot.
Yeah, and we're going to be talking about him even more in the near future.
I should think so. Max Holloway is the one who really stands out to me. There's Brian Ortega in that division as well. Ortega's a weird one. Ortega's the kind of guy who I'm not sure I would actually peg as someone to rely on as a top fighter. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Ortega's like a future Joe Lozon or a Chris Lytle.
Is Ortega Joe Lozon or is he Nate Diaz?
Okay. But even Nate Diaz is kind of Chris Lytle in a sense, or Joe Lozon. He's more technical in his way, but also, like, I think Nate Diaz is still pretty matchup dependent. And you're going to have a lot of guys who are just going to beat Nate Diaz. You know, I don't get the sense that Nate Diaz now would really do that much better against Ben Henderson or against Rafael Dos Anjos. He'd be less injured in the Dos Anjos fight, but I think he'd still get beaten in a similar fashion, you know?
Yeah, it would be. I think it would be a more difficult. It would be a more difficult fight for Dos Anjos, but still the basic outlines of the matchup remain the same. That's fair. Yeah, I'm interested in Ortega, but not that interested in the long run. You know, like I think he can be really good, but yeah, I think that there's going to be a hard ceiling on that when he's fighting a guy who doesn't have a glass chin like Thiago Tavares, or who has a really strong technical top game. I think like. I'll tell you, the guy that I'm looking at in that division is the one who would be the nightmarish matchup for somebody like Brian Ortega, and that would be Mirsad Bektic.
Oh, Mirsad Bektic. Boy, I love Mirsad Bektic so much. Mirsad Bektic is like he's like GSP with power and aggression.
Yep.
Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah. If you put George St. Pierre in the body of an even, or if you put the kind of raw explosiveness of GSP, took it up a notch, put it in the body of a guy who was even bigger, who was even more muscular for the weight class, even stronger, even faster, and 1,000 times meaner. Like, then if you put GSP into it, if you had all of GSP's physical characteristics with more power and the spirit of a guy who grew up in a Bosnian refugee camp, then that's what you end up with in Mirsad Bektic.
Yeah. The spirit of a guy in a Bosnian refugee camp is a good point. Much like the many Dagestani fighters. I almost sounded very offensive saying those Dagestani fighters, you Dagestani people. In that sense, like you get the sense that there's some hardship behind the way that Mirsad Bektic fights. You know what I mean?
I've never seen anybody who was as physically overwhelming as him when he was coming up through the regional scene.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
Just fucking murdered dudes. Like he hit the closest analog I can come up with for his ground striking, and this is even more clear after what he did to Paul Redmond in his second UFC fight, and in brief stretches against Lucas Martins. But like he's the closest analog I can think of for the kind of power that like Brock Lesnar could generate in small spaces on the ground. Mirsad Bektic can do that, but as a 145-pounder.
Yeah, and Bektic is one of the few fighters like Khabib Nurmagomedov. There are very few fighters these days, and I probably have a bit of a striking bias, but there aren't many fighters these days with a heavily grappling based style that I tend to pick as like a fighter that has great future potential, and that's because there's the fight. Every fight starts in the feet. There is always a gap to bridge as a fighter who needs the takedown. And what happens when you meet that first fighter who stops your takedown? If your style is built on that, how do you deal with it? But guys like Khabib Nurmagomedov and definitely like Mirsad Bektic are so very good at bridging that gap and more than comfortable enough in the striking range to stay there long enough to find the openings they need for the takedowns. And I think that bleeds through, that kind of tactical mindset bleeds through into Bektic's ground game because he is just such a systematic fighter where everything he does is capitalizing on 2 or 3 different pieces of information he collected previously. When he comes in behind his jab, he figures out how you react to it. He's going to put a punch or a takedown or a different kind of takedown or a kick behind it depending on your reaction. And then if you escape from that, he's going to do another attack based on your expectation of the takedown. When you're on the ground, he is going to threaten the back take and use that to break your stance down and then use punches to break your post down and flatten you out. It's just everything is so he is a flowchart fighter in a very dangerous sense where there's such a a potent system going on with the way that he fights.
There's an obvious intelligence to it. In terms of what we were talking about earlier in the first segment about in-fight decision-making, Bektic is just brilliant at that.
Yeah.
Like it's really hard to overstate. It's really hard to overstate how good Bektic is. I mean, like I've been on that train for a long time and will remain on it for a while. All he needs to do is stay healthy, and I think he's a top 10 featherweight sooner rather than later.
I think he's probably more like a GSP than a Jon Jones, a little more strategically minded. Probably not. I think Bektic will probably have a tough loss like young GSP at some point when he deals with a fighter who is just more experienced and able to match his athleticism. But
you could see him running into a Ricardo Lamas guillotine, right?
Right,
like,
exactly.
Wouldn't that be like the prototypical way for a guy like Bektic to lose a fight?
Absolutely. A Ricardo Lamas or like Frankie Edgar, like if he gets to the point where he's fighting one of these really experienced, stalwart, top division, top 5 stalwarts, I think that's the kind of loss he will have, but that when he bounces back from that, I think he has tons of potential to be a GSP-like dominant champion in the future because of that systematic way that he fights. And I have big expectations for him. So before we get to our next couple of fighters, and there's one that I definitely want to discuss, why don't we take a quick break? We'll come back. We'll talk about guys such as Albert Tumenov, maybe someone at heavyweight or light heavyweight, and definitely Justin Gaethje, World Series of Fighting lightweight champ, after this. Financial support is fantastic, but there are other, even easier ways to support Heavy Hands. Perhaps the best is by spreading the word. We know our fan base. You're all cool, popular people with serious social media presences. You're tastemakers and trendsetters. Okay, there are one or two of you that don't fit that description. You know who you are, but no matter what, you can always help us out by telling folks about the show. And you can also give us a positive rating and review on iTunes and Stitcher, things like that. We rely on word of mouth and positive feedback to grow and improve, so thank you very much for your time and your help. Now, back to the show. And we are back. Now, before we continue, I did find the Heavy Hands drinking game. Do you want me to run through it real quick?
Yeah, give us a brief rundown here.
Each one has a number of drinks that you should take to account for the commonality of these things happening. So, it is 3 drinks if you and I disagree, which I guess says that it happens rarely, because we're besties. So we agree most usually. Pat correctly pronounces a fighter's name as 1 drink. Connor mispronounces a fighter's name as a drink. I don't know that I mispronounce fighters' names that often. 2 drinks for when someone comments on a fighter's looks. Guilty. 2 drinks for when Connor forgets to thank Bloody Elbow. Guilty. You took 2 drinks at the top of the show if you're playing this game now. 5 drinks if Connor actually remembers to thank Bloody Elbow. 1 drink if Connor uses an obscure boxer as a reference. 2 drinks if Connor announces that he's going to play the heavy bag sound effect before he does. That'll be happening before the end of the show. 5 drinks if the hosts answer your heavy bag question. 32 drinks if episode 32 is ever released. 1 drink if Pat says, "Would you say, Connor?" And 1 drink if they mention something they talked about off the air. It's a pretty brilliant drinking game.
I think they've got us pegged. Maybe listen to less Heavy Hands, assholes.
Yeah. It's one of those things. It's like when some YouTube personality has someone put together a compilation video of all the times they say or something like that. And you're like, Jesus, I do it a lot, don't I?
Oh yeah.
Somebody taps into all of your tendencies. So I think it's funny. I appreciate it, but also. Well, I don't want to say listen to less Heavy Hands. I'm happy to have these guys listening. So that was from @Richard Hemingway on Twitter. Check him out. He listens to a lot of Heavy Hands, and he's got us down pat. And Connor. So the other fighters I want to talk about. Let's just, because we don't have a ton of time here, I want to talk about Justin Gaethje. Because I think Justin Gaethje is one of the most promising fighters out there. He's very, very different from all the other kinds of fighters that we have discussed. Justin Gaethje is one of the few guys with a sort of brawler's mentality that I would actually peg as a serious prospect, and I think he is one of the more misunderstood prospects out there in a lot of ways. I did a little quick post on Reddit on r/MMA a little while ago about Justin Gaethje because after his most recent fight, which did you catch that one, Pat?
I did indeed.
The leg kick TKO over
Ryan Foster.
Who
is a tough, durable, dude.
Yes, absolutely. And a bunch of people were saying, oh, another good win, whatever, but Justin Gaethje's style won't work in the UFC. It won't work at a high level. He's not defensive enough. He gets hit too much. He's too sloppy. He's too aggressive, so on and so forth. The notion seems to be that brawling doesn't cut it in the UFC, but it cuts it in the regionals. Now, firstly, I do want to point out Justin Gaethje's record for a 16-0 undefeated prospect who is still just 27 years old and only began fighting professionally in 2011. That's only 5 years ago. Less than 5 years ago, actually, August of 2011. His record is pretty goddamn phenomenal. The lightweight division, being as deep as it is a pretty tough division to make your name in on the regional circuit. Guys like Brian Foster and Luis Palomino, Melvin Gillard,
JZ
Cavalcante, Brian Cobb. These may not be guys that stand out as being like UFC caliber fighters, but these are experienced opponents. I think the combined win percentage of Justin Gaethje's opponents is something like high 60s to 70%. And the number of fights is in the high 200s or 300s. Combined number of fights.
It's as good a resume as you will find for a guy who you might still technically call a prospect.
Yes, it's comparable to the kind of resume that Uriah Faber had when he got into the WEC. It's a promising resume over very stiff competition, and exactly.
I think it's way better than Faber's resume back when he got into the WEC.
Okay,
way better.
Maybe I'm thinking Faber's resume by the time he fought for the WEC title.
I think if you're looking for an analog for it, I think it's close to Hector Lombard's resume when he entered the UFC.
Okay.
Like, maybe not in terms of quantity, but in terms of quality, I think that's probably as close as you're
sure.
going to get.
Yeah, and so Justin Gaethje's record holds up. It really does when you look at it closely at the stiffness of his competition. I think so too does his style. And I think a lot of what people are saying, the notion that brawling doesn't work in the UFC is a little strange to me. And I think it's because everyone assumes that in the UFC everyone is more technical, and I think it's because everyone assumes that once you get to a certain level of technical ability, you are then impervious to the kind of mental strain it takes to fight a guy with Justin Gaethje's level of aggression. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think I understand the criticisms that are being made of Gaethje, and they're not necessarily wrong-headed criticisms in the sense that he is pathologically aggressive. He gets hit quite a bit, and he wants to have an aggressive type of fight. But with that said, there are a couple of key factors that they're missing. First is that he is technical for what he wants to do. He has good pressure footwork. He's got great timing. He hits really hard. But not only does he hit hard, but his strike selection is outstanding. Like, he consistently picks the right shot at the right time based on what his opponent is showing him.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like he's just winging overhand rights for the sake of winging overhand rights. He throws overhand rights when he sees his opponent pull his gloves in front of his face.
Yeah, speaking of technical or tactical adaptation, I mean, Justin Gaethje is excellent. There's a GIF that I created when I did an article about him a little while ago, last year sometime, I guess after he fought Luis Palomino, of him going for he goes for a single leg takedown. I'm closing my eyes to remember it. He goes for a single leg takedown. He goes for a double leg takedown. Palomino gets in a right underhook, and so then Gaethje switches to a knee tap using the underhooked arm as the sort of tipping force, and then Palomino reacts to that by kicking his legs back, and so then Gaethje turns that tipping arm into a collar tie and uppercuts Palomino and drops him. All of this happening in the space of a single second. These 3 or 4 distinct adjustments, all pertaining to the specific ways that Palomino's reacting to what he's doing. He's a guy who understands how to change your tactics in the moment, like few other fighters do. I think he has a natural talent for it. And
he's a great transitional fighter,
yes.
But that speaks to, the sequence that you're talking about speaks to something that people seem to be forgetting about Gaethje and all of this criticism. He's a striker, he's blah, 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 blah. Well, no, Gaethje was a Division I All-American wrestler.
Yes.
that's not like he's forgotten how to do that. He's got really outstanding takedown defense. He uses his takedowns in both tactical and strategic fashion, but that makes him a monster in tight. He's one of the very best infighters that we've seen in the recent past. He's got great knees. He's got great elbows. He throws leg kicks in and on his way out of the clinch. Like, he is a monstrous inside fighter. And that's frankly not a skill set that we see a whole lot of at 155 pounds. He's one of the few guys that I would say, like, again, this is matchup dependent, but that could actually compete with somebody like Khabib Nurmagomedov in the tie-ups.
Sure, absolutely. And I think, yeah, matchup dependent, of course, like a lot of fighters with a certain kind of, I don't know, with an action-dependent style, matchup dependent. But, like, would you be surprised if Justin Gaethje beat someone like Anthony Pettis? I don't think I would.
I would pick him to beat Anthony Pettis.
Sure. Like that, I think I probably would too. And Anthony Pettis is very good, and Anthony Pettis is an outfighter, and he's very technical. But the thing is certain styles fall apart under the kind of pressure and aggression and the kind of confidence and the pace that a guy like Justin Gaethje brings. And I think I correctly assessed the sort of mentality that he brings into the cage. When I wrote that article, I talked about him not being the kind of fighter who feels like he can afford to take many backward steps, not being the kind of fighter who, I think if you tell Justin Gaethje, hey, don't get hit so much, worry about your defense, you're not only going to hamstring him mentally, but you're going to lead him to be hit more. Because he's suddenly going to start hanging around at range where he's not comfortable and where he's thinking too much about what he's going to do next and especially about what his opponent's going to do next. And he's going to absorb 5 rounds worth of punishment rather than blowing his opponent out of the water while taking 10 to 15 shots in a single round because this guy has only not finished 2 of his 16 opponents. You know, so, and Justin Gaethje responded to the article and he was like, hey, I think you got it spot on. I think you understand me. Like, he basically said that's what it is. So I feel pretty confident saying that Justin Gaethje is a kind of fighter with a special mentality and the physical ability and the tool set to back that mentality up. And I think Justin Gaethje has great potential to be probably not a champion because of the innate unreliability of his style, but definitely a top 10 or even a top 5 lightweight if and when he does come to the UFC.
Yeah, I mean, I think he has one more fight left on his World Series of Fighting contract, and then he'll be testing free agency after that. And I hope that the UFC gives him a nice big offer somewhere in the 60-60 range for his first fight, maybe higher than that.
I think he'll probably want more than that because I'm pretty sure he'll end his World Series of Fighting contract at like 80 or something like that.
Oh wow, yeah. Well, if whatever he asks for, it will be worth it for the UFC to pay him because that man is box office gold.
Yeah, and he's like an instant spice up any fight night kind of fighter. Like even if he doesn't pan out as a prospect, throw Justin Gaethje on the main card of any fight night, and he will be guaranteed excitement.
Yeah, I mean, it should be very clear that you and I are both pretty high on him, but like, I really think he's a top 10 lightweight right now, and I've ranked him as such on our Bleacher Report rankings for the last few months. There's a shameless plug for you. But I've ranked him there not because I think that he could be, but because I think he already is. I would pick him to beat guys like Bobby Green and Evan Dunham and Michael Chiesa and probably Rashid Magomedov. Like, I think that he is already on that level.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm with you. Love me some Justin Gaethje. So let's get to a couple of questions. I think that probably fills up all the time we have to discuss up-and-comers. But that's fun. I hope we I like getting the opportunity to it's a moment of fear when the schedule opens up, the UFC schedule, and you're like, oh, what do we talk about? But there's a liberating feeling as well, getting to talk about guys who don't normally get a lot of shine from us. So I don't want to shock anybody, but we are going to do some questions from listeners. And before we ask these questions, we're going to play a sound effect. I know it startled some people last week. A sound effect came as if from the blue. And so I just want to let everyone know we're going to do the heavy bag. I've given you about 15 seconds to settle yourself in, and here comes our sound effect. And our first question this week comes to us via Lorenzo Wang. And Lorenzo, as well as Ben Cohn, who is our other question asker, both of these guys pledged $5 to Heavy Hands on Patreon. You too can get a guaranteed heavy bag question answered on the show if you pledge that amount or more. So go check that out. Lorenzo asks, why don't we see more limb striking in MMA? I see so many opportunities for hitting elbows, forearms, and hands, or striking the dangling legs and feet of an opponent on his back, kneeing the thighs, etc. It always seems like a wasted opportunity to go ham when someone's on their back. Why dive into full mount? I'm not sure what he means there, because diving into full mount would seem to be a great opportunity. For taps to the face when you could be wrenching an extended leg around for some uppercuts to the hamstring. So I don't know if I would suggest uppercuts to the hamstring as the most viable sort of limb strike, but there is a point, a viable point that Lorenzo made there. Why do you think we don't see more limb striking in MMA, Pat? Or do we, in fact, see enough of it?
Well, I think that he is right in pointing to some missed opportunities for maybe for strikes that are maybe not the most obvious ones on the ground. I think, in general, it's hard to punch somebody hard enough in the legs for it to be worth your while.
Unless you're Ben Henderson.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure, Ben Henderson.
Yeah, unless you're just
or
weird...
Yoel Romero.
Sure, yeah.
But again, those are on the feet, and you can get a lot more force behind it. It's hard to punch somebody hard enough on the ground in the leg to make that worth your while, or in the arms too. Like, I don't think that really matters all that much.
Somebody recently did that, a good fighter too. They were throwing like uppercuts or crosses at the opponent's thighs or legs on the ground. I wish I could remember who it was.
I recall that, but I don't remember who it was exactly.
Probably because it didn't make a big impact on the fight.
Yeah, I mean, but so I do think that there are missed opportunities. I would like to see more guys throw shots to the body on the ground. I don't think we see nearly enough of that.
Yeah,
like we see a lot of exclusive head striking on the mat.
Yeah, although we heard from Jason High when he was on the show that he doesn't feel body shots hurt when you're on your back.
Well, I think that comes back to a lot of issues with ground striking technique that we don't really see guys torque into body punches the way they do into shots to the head.
Yeah.
So
Fedor, GSP, very good body punchers on the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that there's room for that to be a thing. Now, I think there's also more room for shots not to the arms but to the shoulders, which is painful and is a thing that can jack you up, especially if you're in the ground, you're in a front headlock. Throw knees to the shoulders. Like, that's absolutely a thing that you could be doing from that position, even if you can't knee to the head.
Yeah, I'm with Lorenzo here to an extent. I think, limb striking, it shouldn't score. It shouldn't put you ahead on the scorecards because that is technically blocking a strike. But if you can use somebody's defensive acuity against them, if you're having a difficult time finding somebody's head, for example, and all you have are their arms, or if you're having a difficult time kicking their body and all you have are their arms or their hip, why not go for what they're giving you? And if it's a very smart move to make, especially early in a fight, much like body shots, when you can start to have an increased impact as the fight goes on. If you're hitting somebody in their shoulder over and over when they're giving you a double forearm guard, then at some point they're going to have trouble getting that hand up in time to cover their face. It makes sense. I don't think it's a thing that you would want to go for as a primary tactic because, again, it doesn't score. And we've even seen that a scoring strike, like a knee to the leg, doesn't score that highly in the eyes of most judges. You're rarely going to win a round just by kneeing someone in the leg. They tend to view that more as you investing in the future rounds rather than you doing meaningful damage in the moment. But if you're looking to invest, it definitely makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I can see it. I just think it might be those things might cost more energy than it's worth.
Yes, that's
past a certain point.
Yeah, like I'm saying, if they're giving you those targets, then I say go for it. Just as if somebody's covering and catching your jabs, hell yeah, jab them in the chest or jab them in the shoulder. But I wouldn't waste energy going for it. Maybe if it's Jon Jones and you want to try and crack him behind the elbow when he stiff arms your head. Something like that. But even then, that's not the kind of... It's just not a very proven tactic. We hear a lot of these stories, particularly from boxers, guys like Bernard Hopkins. Don't drink. That's not an obscure boxer. Who talk about hitting arms and stuff like that. But the kind of defense you see in MMA doesn't lend itself to that as much. Bernard Hopkins has fought a lot of guys who put their shoulder in front of their chin and make it very difficult to find their chin. And so, yeah, you hit their shoulder if they're giving it to you. But if you're in MMA and the guy is fighting with a double forearm guard and he's giving you a square stance, like you have other opportunities to attack before you start trying to attack a guy's limbs.
Yeah, let's focus on let's focus on some of the other possibilities before we get to limb striking.
Because if you're banking on the fact that that'll hurt a guy, like some guys just don't care. Floyd Mayweather, also not an obscure boxer, don't drink. Floyd Mayweather has never given a shit that people hit his shoulder. It may have had an effect on him, but it's never been discernible. And he's gotten his shoulder hit a lot throughout his career, and he's always been okay. You know, and anyone who would have gone into a fight with Floyd Mayweather banking on the idea that hitting him in the shoulder would lead to victory, they've all been rebuffed. So it just can't be a linchpin. But if you want to dishearten a guy, you want to do a little accumulative damage, I say go for it. I think it shows a level of craft, a certain level of craftiness. One more question before we wrap it up. We've got this one from Ben Cohn, and Ben asks, in honor of Tom Lawler doing pretty well so far since moving up to light heavyweight, which fighters do you feel would do well if they moved up a division or more? Dodson is another on my mind since he's moving up. Jon Dodson, that is. What about you two? What do you say, Pat?
Well, so I'm not convinced that Dodson is going to have a ton of success moving up.
Yeah.
Because I think he's a low volume, kind of in and out striker to start with. And guys like that, when you're going to be giving up a lot of height and a lot of reach to, like guys like, is a good example. There are 5'9" bantamweights out there. Like Jon Dodson's going to be giving up 6 inches, and while he can knock anybody out at any time, he's got the power to do that. Like that is a lot of distance to cover over and over again, and you wonder whether his cardio can hold up, whether he can score enough to win decisions if he doesn't get the knockout. Those are problems. But I think there are plenty of guys in MMA with the frame to fight up a division who are starving themselves and cutting so much water weight to get down, and they don't need to be doing it.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm with you on Dodson too. I wonder if having a speed advantage at bantamweight, is it worth going up against guys who are bigger and will probably have more success against your counter wrestling, and also guys who can probably take your shots better? Don't know.
Yeah. There are a lot of concerns there. But so in terms of guys who I think could move up and be okay, I think Michael Mcdonald at bantamweight, I think he could move up to featherweight, and I think he could be okay because he's got a huge frame and could stand to put on some muscle instead of dieting his way down to 135.
It might actually help him it might make him a better defensive wrestler if he had a little more muscle on that frame.
Exactly, even if you were fighting guys who were bigger.
Another bantamweight who is moving up, I think I'm interested to see how Renan Barão does at featherweight.
Yeah, I think he's a little small, and a lot of his problems were not so much that he was cutting too much weight as it was that his diet was not good, which led to him cutting a lot of weight that he didn't need to cut. Like, I think he is actually a bantamweight, but he's one who has kind of eaten his way out of that division.
Sure, but I do think that a lot of his problems too with basically smaller, faster opponents will be helped a little bit at featherweight. I mean, I still think guys like Max Holloway definitely beat Renan Barão, but I think you could put him in there with a guy like Dennis Bermudez and get a pretty competitive fight.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested to see how he does, but I think his height is still a bit of a concern for me there. Yeah. Let's see. There's a lot of these guys. Let me look. Let me pull up a list.
Zach Cummings, future extraordinary journeyman. I think Zach Cummings will be a great middleweight and I do expect him to go there when he eventually goes to 185.
Yeah, I think he's a guy who would be perfect for that division. I mean, if we're talking about bigger name fighters, eventually I think Rory McDonald should probably end up at middleweight. He's a big dude. He's a big dude. He's still putting on size. I think Luke Rockhold would make a fine light heavyweight. I think he's certainly big enough for that division.
Of course, Jon Jones is a heavyweight.
Yeah, that's the one that we've been talking about forever. But I think even Alexander Gustafsson, I think, would be a perfectly fine-sized heavyweight.
I think Gustafsson would do well as a heavyweight. I really think he would. I think his speed would be a great credit to him there. Having less mobile opponents would help make up for some of his footwork deficiencies. I think he'd be a great heavyweight.
Yeah, for sure. I think like in MMA, I would eventually like to see a restructuring of the weight classes. I would like to see more weight classes in MMA. Maybe not to the extent that we have it in boxing.
Yeah.
But I think having 15-pound jumps between lightweight and welterweight and middleweight at the most talent-rich divisions, where you could easily add another weight class, where you could do 155, 165, 175, 185, like where you could add in more weight classes, and you would be fine talent-wise. You wouldn't be stripping out any of those divisions, and you would be making it a lot easier for guys.
Yeah, 10 pounds doesn't seem too bad, but I am always scared because I have had so much trouble caring about boxing these days. Since Mayweather-Pacquiao, it's like, boy, what else is there? And that makes me sound like a casual boxing fan, which I'm not. I love boxing, but I tend to watch more like classic boxing these days because it's just so hard to care about each division. It's so hard to build these kind of narratives when everyone is just like fighting everyone and haggling over weight, and a part of it has to do with how many weight classes there are. There are no prestige divisions in boxing anymore. And so I do get nervous about the notion of adding a bunch of weight classes. But I'm also curious to know, and I think we'll probably get more examples, guys following the Conor McGregor example, following the Dustin Poirier example, getting both financial and physical rewards from moving up in weight. I'm curious to know whether or not I fully understand how weight plays a role in MMA compared to boxing. Because I don't think, like Conor McGregor definitely learned, you can't just be Henry Armstrong. You can't be this crazy, there's maybe an obscure boxer, maybe a chance to drink, depending on how obscure you think Henry Armstrong is. But you can't just be this like crazy aggressive little crazy atom of energy punching and moving your way forward and move up 20 pounds the way you can in boxing, because grappling plays a big role. And when somebody is big on the ground and is just as skilled as you or close to as skilled as you, or they have you pressed against the fence, or they can absorb your shots and then exhaust you to the point where they can grapple you, I think it's different than in a striking-only sport.
Well, and the range is so much different in MMA too, because a 3-inch height difference in MMA, like if you're used to fighting guys who are 5'9" and suddenly you're fighting guys who are 6 feet, like in MMA that range difference exacerbates itself because you can add kicks to the mix.
Yes,
and because the spacing is so much different.
Yeah, so I don't know if I fully understand it, but I am definitely at this point behind the idea of guys not killing themselves to make weight. We've discussed this before. It's a bit of a prisoner's dilemma for these guys. But hopefully a few more fighters in the near future take the, and like I said, I have hope for Renan Barão, because I think if Renan Barão does fairly well at featherweight, other fighters will not be as scared to give it a try and to move up.
There's going to be a point at which the floodgates just open, and we see more and more fighters moving up. And I think as we see more guys starting younger and younger, we're going to see that more too. Like guys who, when you start fighting at 20 or 21, like you're a physically different person at 29 or 30 than you were when you first started.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, well, I think that wraps it up. Thanks, Ben, for your question. Thanks, Lorenzo, for your question. And thank you, everybody at home, for listening. You got anything for the people to look out for this week, Pat?
Yeah, I'm doing a piece that's kind of riffing on the idea of building the perfect fighter and exactly what that entails. And then I will have something else out too. I'm not quite sure what. I'm still bouncing around some ideas.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I'm thinking of maybe doing a ground and pound piece. Maybe I will do a Jon Jones infighting piece. Since the week of Jones versus Cormier, I'm going to do a pair of gaps in the armor pieces. How to beat the champion and how to beat the number one fighter in the world.
Maybe wait to see how Jon Jones's court situation goes before you start working on those.
Yeah, that too. So this week, and I may be working on another piece of Phil McKenzie. Hopefully you guys out there have been enjoying the League of Extraordinary Journeyman pieces. The middleweight division is truly a weird place, and it's a lot of fun to talk about, but who knows? Google my name every 2 hours, and something will happen this week. Otherwise, I can't give you too much concrete information. But I do appreciate you guys tuning in, listening to the show. We've had a fantastic month, picking up new listeners all the time, and we're happy to have you with us. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Heavy Hands. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.